What's up, guys? This is Jan for Chess24. Not that much top chess going on these days after Dortmund and Bilbao are over and people are waiting for the Sinquefield Cup. But there is a little match going on in Switzerland between my dear friend and co-worker, I think we can say, Peter Svidler here at Chess24, and the new world number 2, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. I'm not sure we can declare him world number 2 officially, but in the live rating list, he's currently occupying that spot. They play a match against each other, a bunch of rapid games, then 4 classical games, and the game we are gonna look at, fix that, Jan, is the third game of the classical portion of the match. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave leads with a score of 1.5 after the first 2 classical games. So here we go, game number 3, Peter Svidler with the white pieces, goes for e4, and MVL, one of the few top players who has a very narrow opening repertoire, sticks with the opening. He pretty much always plays the Najdorf Sicilian. Here we go, Najdorf, and Svidler goes for the move that's still the fashionable move, I would say. It's been the fashionable move for like 10 years, I'm not sure that's still accurate, but no longer a surprise to see top grandmasters play the move h3 here, preparing g4. This is what Svidler does, not the first time in the rapid leg of the match. He already went for this, and already there MVL went for e6. Like many others, he used to prefer the move e5, and here after knight d2, h5 or b5. There's been countless top-level encounters. White's plan is to play g4, no matter what, hence the popularity of h5. But this time around, MVL decides, you know what, I can allow g4 and live, and after g4, he goes for a move that, well, has become popularish as well, the move h6, which to me makes sense because ideally white would like to go h4 and then g5, kick this knight away, but then you have to lose a whole tempo by moving your h-pawn twice. You just used it to go h3 to prepare g4. And that's kind of the abstract reasoning. I'm not enough of a Sicilian expert to give you the status of lines like knight ft7, bishop e7. I believe these are considered to be, I like my disclaimer and then getting into a theoretical debate. These are considered to be dubious nowadays because of an early g5, bishop g5, knight e6, little tricks. So maybe that explains the popularity of h6, which was chosen by the French number 1. Bishop g2, bishop e7. In the rapid game, Svidler played normally, quote-unquote, with bishop e3, queen e2, and so on and so forth. Then f4 didn't achieve anything special, and for this classical game he's prepared something different. A very sharp idea, and I'm sure an idea we're gonna see around more. We are gonna see around more. I might learn, I might not. He goes h4, even though that does lose a tempo, as I was talking about earlier. The idea is very brutal. Just go g5, kick this knight away. That's why we played g4 in the first place. Black has a choice here. MVL plays the most logical, or arguably the most logical, knight c6, fighting back in the center against white's flank aggression. Now the logical move is to play g6, just trying to stop this white pawn from reaching that square. g5, hg, bishop g5 was played here in a Sutovsky game. For hg, rook h1, bishop h1, knight h7, f4, e5. Play could get extremely sharp very early on. Outcome unknown, to me at least. But knight c6, logically enough, leads to a forced sequence that Svidler, of course, had a look at before the game. Knight h7. Knight d7 might look more normal, but g6 is still a problem. Fg, knight e6 you don't want, and knight d4, gf, or even queen d4, probably queen d4 first. And the black king could feel a little lonely. Therefore knight h7, keeping an eye on the e6 pawn and targeting Mr. Goran 5. Knight takes c6, not forced, but logical. B takes c. It's logical because, first of all, c6 could become a target for this bishop, and secondly, white frees his queen from having to cover the d4 knight for active operations. Queen h5 could have been one of these active operations, was not played in the game. I guess Svidler didn't think much about the position after knight f8, stopping g6, because knight takes g5, f4 is not a great idea. This knight would be trapped. Instead, Svidler went for the more aggressive way to play the move g6, pawn sacrifice, maybe temporary, maybe not temporary, but certainly spoiling the black structure. Black has to take, f takes g, and queen to d3, hinting at e5 with a double attack, bishop c6 and queen g6. If white starts with e5, then black has time to go d5, queen d3, knight f8, and kind of covering everything behind his solid pawn formation. So the immediate queen d3 is more logical, because if black now goes knight f8, he's a bit passive and white can just continue developing bishop e3, long castle. Very nice compensation for the pawn. Therefore, MVL, instead of knight f8, went for e5, just physically blocking this pawn from advancing. This is the best move, but white has decent long-term compensation here if he goes for something like bishop d2, followed by long castles. The problem for black is always his king struggles to find a safe haven, and if he does something active, these pawns will all become targets. So yeah, I like white here, even though I'm sure future battles and future computer evaluations might mess with that assessment. The computer says 0-0 here after bishop g4, but it feels dangerous for black to me. Anyway, Svidler played an over-the-board inspiration move that looks very good as well, the move queen to c4, targeting c6 and the g8 square. You have to cover those, and MVL, well, you have to cover at least one of those, and MVL does that by going bishop to d7. Queen g8 is not a big threat yet. After knight f8, queen g7, bishop g5. White would have lost too much time and misplaced his queen just for a measly g-pawn. Not what white wanted. Instead, Svidler now plays a logical bishop d2. The big white trump card here is that his king will always be safer than the black king. Bishop g5, you could argue about that move. Of course, it's nice to exchange your passive bishop. On the other hand, that makes the d6 pawn really weak, and it might have been more prudent to go for something like knight f6, long castles, queen b6, with an unclear position, would be my guess. Black is a pawn up, problems with the king. Same old, same old. But bishop g5 was played, long castles, and queen to f6, kind of a risky move. But here it's already not so easy to keep control over the d6 pawn. Queen f6. Here, Compy Boy wants bishop takes g5, intending knight takes g5, queen g8, just winning the pawn back with a very pleasant endgame, because a lot of isolated pawns in the black camp. And if black were to take with the queen here, which is check, make no mistake, it is check. But after king b1, he still struggles from having to keep an eye on that weakness. This position seems to be in white's favor as well, once again, because the black king doesn't know where to go. Many plausible moves, knight a4, an idea we're going to see in the game later, intending knight b6 or bishop g2, just improving this bishop, seem to leave white on top. But Svidler played, actually not later, he played knight a4 immediately, was later very critical of that move, because he said his opponent had the very strong queen to e6. But even after queen e6, it looks to me like white stays a tad better. Knight b6 is a strong move, because now after the queen exchange, this pawn d6 is once again a goner. For example, king e7, knight takes d6, bishop d2, rook d2, and white is a little better due to his structure once again. Instead, MVL played a more human move, or no, you can always argue about these things. Played a natural move, rook b8, covering the b6 square. But that gave Peter the chance to leave the queens on the board, and he did so. Bishop takes g5. Knight g5 once again, not a great idea, because you have to defend this endgame after queen g8, takes and takes. Therefore, queen g5 check, king to b1. And the usual problems. d6 weak, king weak, a6 hanging now. Not a great position for black. Knight to f6 solves one of the problems, covers the g8 square. White has a pretty pleasant choice. Rook d6 is not part of that pleasant choice, because queen g1 would lead to checkmate, but he could already have captured this pawn on a6. Instead, Svidler played a3, which is also a good move, just making a look for the king, and forever stopping any counterplay based on rook b4, rook d4 ideas, keeping up the pressure. MVL goes queen h4, very hard to keep everything under control here. Should have said this before. King e7, queen a6, doesn't look like a very nice position either. But it was an alternative way to play. Now rook h8, hope to find some counterplay there. Queen h4 targets f2. Queen to d3. One of the star moves of this game, a very, very strong little move. Because if you take on a6, things aren't that clear. Queen f2, rook d6 is still not great because this bishop is always dropping. And the immediate rook d6, of course, runs into queen h1. So queen d3 is very strong because the queen wants to get to d6. And if it does, that would be very bad news for black. Therefore, MVL tries to stop that by going d5. But d5 not only weakens his structure, but also gives his knight the powerful c5 is the name of that square. Powerful c5 square. Here the black position has become really ugly. Many threats like knight d7 followed by ed, just blowing the position open. So MVL tries to keep closed what can be kept closed by playing d5 to d4, when white once again has a pleasant choice. f3 might not look pretty, but stabilizes the structure, leads to a big advantage. Nothing wrong with the move played in the game either. Queen a6. Black to stay in the game has to take on f2, else he's just suffering for free. So queen takes f2, best chance, and Svidler continues to activate his pieces with a very logical rook f1, keeping an eye on f6. Queen to g3, and here it was time to cash in, but Svidler misses his chance. The move queen to a7 not only targets the rook and the bishop and threatens rook f6, it also covers the c5 knight, which might not sound very relevant, but it is in some other lines we're gonna see later, because with this knight defended, black never has the counterplay of takes, check, and then taking the knight. So after queen a7, black is in trouble. Rook c8, let's say, loses to rook takes f6, and then this drops, while rook d8 defends the bishop, but then knight b7 is very nasty, targeting this guy. If it goes here, white wins it anyway. So that would have been a good moment to cash in. Black would have faced a thankless defense after rook d8. I don't know. Some weird lines. Knight b7, bishop h3, rook c1, rook d7. We don't have to continue this forever, but white is fairly on top here because it's just much more active. King f7, knight d8. I will continue it forever. After I said I won't. Let's just make 18 more computer moves and then come up with a random assessment like white is much better. So that could have happened, but it didn't happen. Instead, Svidler played the move bishop to f3, which is nice because cutting off the queen, stopping any queen c3 or rook b2 shenanigans, and he's also trying to activate his bishop, which wasn't doing anything on h1, to the max. And if this bishop gets to c4 or even d3, then the black position is beyond repair as well. But MVL shows why he's been having a great year, and he does not crumble easily. That's what all these super strong grandmasters have in common. You can't just build a good position and hope it wins itself, because they're all incredibly tenacious. Queen h3 is a little demonstration of that. Very nice move. Stopping queen to a7, keeping an eye on d7, and just keeping white a little busier in general. And also correctly estimating that the tempting rook h1 does not lead to immediate disaster. This was played in the game, rook h1, intending rook h8, winning an exchange, but MVL has seen that this is not the end of the game. And if we can trust our computer friends, white should not have grabbed that exchange, but played a move like queen c4 or queen d3, kept the status quo, and kept an advantage because of his safer king. But of course, easier said than done. One key point to be mentioned is that after bishop e2, which I mentioned earlier, this bishop gets here or here, white is in great shape. Now this counterplay works. Rook b2, king b2, queen c3, king b1, queen c5. The position is unclear. With the departure of this knight, black has improved his chances tremendously. But Svidler went for rook h1, leading to a direct clash. Rook h8 check, king e7, rook takes b8. White wins an exchange, but black has some counterplay. And surprisingly, he even has two ways here to generate it. One way would have been queen d1, king a2, queen takes c2, with a mess computer says this is playable, queen a7, king d6, and it doesn't see a win for white. But MVL goes for a different route. He goes knight takes e4. Now, the first question and the question asked in the game is, of course, what happens after knight takes d7? But as you can see by the engine bar, that's not a great idea. Instead, Peter should have played knight takes e4. It's probably smart to give this check to lure the king to a2, so it doesn't cover c2 anymore. And here, once again, it seems like black has solved most of his problems, isn't exchanged down, but has enough counterplay with the passed g pawn, with c2 hanging. Compy Boy says king b1 with equality here. When black, if he so chose, could already give it perpetual. Instead, white, who's had a nice position for most of the game, goes for knight takes d7, which looks very tempting after king takes d7, queen b7 check. White comes first. Not a surprise, really. This would just not work at all. But instead, black has some very nasty counterplay. And kudos for MVL for having calculated everything very, very correctly here. He starts with knight d2 check. This is key. You might have seen the idea of queen d1 followed by knight d2, but that doesn't quite work. We're gonna get to why in a minute, but knight d2 check is extremely powerful. Point is, if white goes king c1, it looks natural, then black has the very nice move queen to e3. Turns out that white doesn't really have a check, or at least not a useful check, with his army of forces around the naked king. Well, black is threatening a very useful check, queen e1 checkmate. That can't be parried by c3, d3 either. So if white goes king d1, stopping that, then there's knight f3, threatening queen d2 checkmate or queen e1 checkmate. And after queen e2, queen g1, the geometry and the scary queen-knight attacking tandem once again wins the day. So you can't go king c1, you can't go king a1 because of queen d1, followed by queen b1 mate. But you can go king a2, or at least it looks like that. That was played in the game. And now if black played queen d1 or queen h1, which he could have started with, then nothing too bad has happened to white. He goes a4, queen b1, king a3, say queen a1, king b4, queen b2, king a5. And this king will run to the opposite corner, where it's going to be quite safe. Let's not forget, white is currently a rook up. So this looks very pleasant for white. But MVL had foreseen another great resource, and that's why this move order was important. To start with knight d2 check, because he can include queen d5 check here. This more or less forces white to go b3. Rook b3 is just thankless after king d7. Black would sooner or later win the queen's endgame. c4, dc3 check doesn't really help. So b3 more or less forced, and now with the pawn on b3, queen h1 gains in strength. The difference is there's still a checkmate threat of queen b1, which can only be parried with a4. But here, queen b1, king a3, queen a1, king b4. There is the very useful move queen c3 check, stopping the white king from running away, forcing it back home. After king a3, however, it turns out that black doesn't want a perpetual, but he wants more than that. Goes knight b1. Once again, we see queen and knight working together extremely nicely. And this is already the last move of the game. Svidler did resign after knight b1 check. Let's briefly check out why. King a2, only legal move. Queen takes c2 check. King a1, only legal move. And knight c3 or knight d2. It turns out that all white has is a couple spike checks like rook e8, but there's no perpetual and there is no way to stop the mating threats. So MVL wins that game, takes a decisive lead in their match. I haven't been counting the rapid portion. He also won the rapid portion, but in the classical only. He's leading with 2.5 half. One more game to play, but the match is over already. And that also means that MVL picks up some more rating, is the clear number 2 in the world now with, I believe, 2.819. Already getting kind of close to rarefied Magnus Carlsen Eder. We'll see if he can keep it up, but certainly a great year for the French number 1. And of course, it's always sad to see our friend Peter Svidler lose like this after playing a very good game. But then he could not seal the deal. He might look back at this queen g3, queen a7 moment, for example. But MVL keeps defending the Najdorf, wins a nice game. And I want to thank you guys for watching. Apologies for the lighting conditions, in case you notice one of the lights in the studio here just, I don't know, made this click sound and disappeared. So I had to improvise a bit. I'm sure it's gonna be better next video. Thank you for your tolerance and your patience, all that. See you in the next video. Bye bye.